All right, so before I get started, actually I'm going to need my slide deck up there, but before I get started, how many people here, hands up if you are an open source developer? All right, so let me get a big cheer for open source. Woo! Guys, that was pretty bad. Microsoft. Boo! You can do that with me, it's cool. Thank you, I got one. Open source, yay! Microsoft, boo. But Microsoft does a whole bunch of open source, and that's actually what this talk is about. So I'm a developer. I'm not in any way a spokesman for my company. I'm a spokesman for me. And this talk is what came out of my decision to start working for the evil empire, for Microsoft. And I think most people don't analyze things quite the same way that I do. So I'd like to share that with you. And in some sense, it's a bit of a case study for other large enterprise organizations, especially other software companies, though everybody's a software company now. And in some ways, it's a case study for other developers, and in some ways, it's a bit of insight into how it actually works on the inside, and is this real? Because that was the central question for me. We'll get there in a minute. I should tell you, normally this is a 40-minute talk, so I drank 25% more caffeine. I'm going to try and speak 25% faster so that you can get the full content, but regardless, I'm around for the next couple of days, and I would love to chat with any of you about this further. So first of all, my cred. So you might have heard of me in the Drupal community as the Huge Manatee. I'm pretty visible within Drupal, within PHP, within Linux, and that's been a large part of my career. I've been in tech for almost 20 years and in open source part of tech for 18 of those, and increasingly open source portions of that. So starting from being assistant director of Unix administration for a university, where you're doing quite a lot with Linux, to actually being a consultant at an open source focused agency, to being somebody who works almost exclusively in open source today. So that's my background. And this talk here is focused around three big points. First of all, why did I join Microsoft as somebody with an open source background? Second of all, what's it actually like on the inside? And the third section is the Ask Me Anything. And I encourage you really, no holds barred. I'm not a spokesperson. I don't work for marketing. There are things that I can give you my opinion about that are in no way binding, and I'm very happy to help you with that. So, why I joined. This section is a little bit of copy pasta. I made quite a long blog post at the time explaining my reasoning. You're welcome to have a look there, but you're going to get most of the same content here. When I came into open source, Microsoft was the big bad wolf. Anti-open source is like the understatement of the year here. Is anybody here old enough? Hands up if you're old enough to remember the Halloween documents. Yeah, a couple of us. All right, so for those who don't remember that was 1998. It was a leak of a series of memos, a chain of emails from inside Microsoft, where we learned a few key things. We learned that Microsoft had an intentional campaign of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Their words, FUD. Around Linux. And that involved spreading false PRs, frivolous lawsuits, all sorts of stuff. We found out about embrace, extend, extinguish, which was Microsoft's official policy towards open source at the time. Hands up if you know embrace, extend, extinguish. All right, so quick background on that. You take an open structure, like let's say HTML. HTML is great, it does wonderful things, so we're going to embrace that and create a product that implements the standard. Internet Explorer browser, isn't this wonderful? Now we're going to extend that standard with things like ActiveX controls, some custom JavaScript behaviors, maybe a Java virtual machine. Don't even start the Java people on what Microsoft was like at the time. And we're going to make those things available for other people to implement. You can run ActiveX controls in Netflix. And we're going to do that until those elements are really visible in the market, until they're almost a dominant force. And then we're going to extinguish by cutting off everyone's rights to use those extensions, so that the only way your website will work is for people who are running Internet Explorer. Now, in the Halloween documents, they talked about this with HTML, they talked about this with Java, they talked about this with a whole bunch of different things, and that was the Microsoft official policy. What a bunch of dicks. We found out the SCO lawsuits, if anybody remembers those. That was a bunch of lawsuits where they threatened, SCO Unix threatened to sue every user of Linux everywhere in the world for intellectual property infringement. Because the Linux kernel had sections that they said were stolen from SCO Unix. And everybody wondered, how the hell is SCO Unix, a failing company at the time, how are they bankrolling this? Oh, it turns out Microsoft was bankrolling it. Just behind the scenes, they were shoveling big piles of money and lawyers into these lawsuits. So that was my beginning. We heard open source is a cancer. That was actually from a little bit later. At the time, I think it was open source is a bunch of amateurs, and how can they compete with us? So that was my direction. And then in 2014, Microsoft abruptly changed policy on this. They got a new CEO, Satya Nadella. And this is my summation of his open source policy, is it's not a tumor. It's not all that bad. Now, as a good open source warrior, right, I didn't trust any of this. This was so clearly a wolf in sheep's clothing. And it didn't matter how much they did, right? So yes, Visual Studio Code is a great IDE, and it's totally open source. And okay, it's the biggest project with the most contributors in the world. But we know that this is all just BS, right? And we know that TypeScript is basically the only thing that makes JavaScript reasonable. But we know this is all just BS. They open sourced PowerScript, they joined the Linux Foundation, platinum member of the Open Source Initiative. Like, what the hell? Who expected that to happen? But that's just throwing money at the problem. Linux subsystem on Windows. I mean, it didn't matter what they did. People like me, or me specifically, I wouldn't believe them. I wouldn't trust them because of my background. And then I met a Microsoft guy at a PHP conference. And he wasn't even wearing Kevlar. This is Josh Holmes, who until recently worked in my department. And the first thing I said when I met him with his Microsoft shirt was, "What are you doing here? I mean, don't you know this, the PHP community is not exactly welcoming to you proprietary guys?" And so he gave me the backstory, and that's what I want to relate to you here. So in 2007, Josh went on a field trip to visit the big Silicon Valley conferences, all the big startup events, to try and figure out what was Microsoft's presence like in that ecosystem, fastest growing market in the world, and we want to make sure we have a piece of it. And he came back and delivered his report to Steve Ballmer. The title that he gave the report, at least when describing it to me, was, well, the good news is no one is making jokes about Microsoft anymore. The bad news is they're not even making jokes about Microsoft anymore. That's how irrelevant we are in this space. And it became clear very quickly that if Microsoft wanted to have a piece of this pie, and it needed to remain on the list of biggest companies, they had to start softening their stance. Fast forward a few years, and Josh got to form one of Microsoft's first big open source departments, the Partner Catalyst team. I'm going to let him describe the Partner Catalyst team. This is from a video blog from a big open source interviewer, which should tell you a bit about his perspective on it.
My full-time job is writing open source software at Microsoft. And so what I do, the Partner Catalyst team that I'm the Director of Architecture for.
Director of Architecture, Partner Catalyst team under
Developer Experiences, which used to be known as the Developer and Platform Evangelism team. Okay, so yeah.
Yay, corporations!
So anyways, in short, we're in the evangelism department, so we are a outward-facing, community-facing group. But very specifically, we work with a lot of startups and the very, very top edge of the enterprise space. And we look at their toughest problems, and we go solve those problems with open source. So our team, we've got about 70 engineers and architects, and we go work with the startups hand in hand. We'll sit down and we'll pair program with them. Sometimes it will be a large enough problem that we'll take it off on our own and we'll work on it for a while, and we'll come back and give them the code. But everything that we do ends up in GitHub under typically an MIT or Apache 2 license, if it's original work that we're doing on our own, or a lot of times we're actually working within open source projects. So
it goes on like this. The TLDR of this, 70 engineers solving startup problems with open source software and contributing the results back. That was pretty impressive to me, right? 70 engineers is a good-sized consulting firm. And what's more, these guys are explicitly implementing solutions that are not Microsoft products, likely competing products, and improving them. Actually, it sounded better than my job at the time with a fully open source consultancy. And that's what started getting me interested. So when Microsoft approached me to work with them in what came out of the PCT, I decided I was going to do an analysis where I would try and ignore the PR, try and make and test predictions, use every resource at my disposal to work out, is this really just embrace, extend, extinguish Mark II? Or are they really changing? So the easy part is quotes, and I have 100 like this. These ones are my favorite, right? Satya Nadella, the CEO, stood up in front of a huge poster, Microsoft Heart Linux, in 2016, and he constantly says things like, oh, we're all in on open source. But I think the best explanation for why comes here from Mark Rusinovich, who's running Azure. If that's how developers want it done, that's where Microsoft will go. And you can see variations on that over and over and over again from the C-suite and from really senior people within Microsoft, is fundamentally it's our job to be where the developers are if we want to have a future as a company. But of course, actions speak louder than words. So Satya did a lot of house cleaning when he came in. All the names that you may or may not remember from the Halloween documents, from the SCO trials, from all of that kind of dirty dealing, those guys aren't there anymore. They're replaced with people like Ross Gardler, who was running the Apache Foundation. Yes, I trust that Ross understands open source and has honest intentions about it. Wim Kuckerts from Oracle's Linux group, who's a major luminary within Linux. Actually, I have a longer list than I'm going to go through. Gabe Monroy, Brendan Burns from Kubernetes. So they had a big change of staffing in the leadership level. Of course, we do things like now they maintain Linux and a BSD distro. Now we own the GitHub repo with the most contributors in the world, VS Code, and TypeScript is also quite close up there. Biggest single code contributor to Docker, top 5 contributor to the Linux kernel in 3.x, founding member of the Open Container Project. Actually, there's lots of stuff like this that's all about, especially interoperability. That's really their jam. But the most important thing to me was to look at the money. The nice thing about publicly traded companies is that we can look at where the money goes. Now, unfortunately, this chart only goes to 2016. That's partly a result of when I was doing my analysis, and it's partly because Microsoft has reorganized its accounting and its departments, so I can't do a one-to-one match here. But the trends that are worth noting. Windows. Okay, we got some users in 2010. That's nice with Windows 10. But that ship isn't going anywhere, right? Office. Holy shit, we all wish we had a product that was doing that. But the best part is the line in the middle that always looked to me like, oh, this was supposed to be the average of the numbers. No, this is Azure. This is server products. So when I looked at this chart, my first thought was, well, I know where I would invest, right? There's a dead end here in the license-driven products. There's huge profit potential in software as a service and platform as a service. And of course, when I phrase it that way, my next line is, well, obviously, we've known that for a long time. So if that's the case, if software as a service and platform as a service are really where the money is, That means that has a few corollaries. So first of all, flexibility and portability are at a huge premium for Microsoft, right? As the CEO of Azure put it close to the beginning, yeah, well, if we built a cloud that was Windows only, how long do you think that would last, right? We knew that we needed to have the flexibility to run Linux workloads, and actually, frankly, in the virtualization space, a lot of our infrastructure has to be running there. We actually have to embrace open source because those are the workloads that are out there, and we have to focus on being maximally interoperable there. Also, in the new technology world, in the technology world that we've seen evolve in the last decade or so, open culture is really valuable. And I mean that internal to a company. Nowadays, you actually need a lot of cross-pollination, and in a large organization, that's challenging. So the go-to example is machine learning. We have a lot of really smart people who are doing very good work in the machine learning space. But machine learning is involved in Windows and in Cortana, and it was involved in the mobile phone, and it's involved in LinkedIn, and it's involved in autocorrect in Word, and it's involved in Excel, and it's involved in every damn product that they've got. So you have two options here. You can either spread your AI people thin on the ground and try and get a few experts in each area and waste a lot of money, or you can really encourage people to interoperate and share knowledge across their teams. So Microsoft, and I'll tell you this part now, this is a teaser for later. Some of this open culture stuff has been incredibly successful in Microsoft. So I'm in a chat room with a bunch of the other Linux users at Microsoft, and we talk about what a pain in the ass the VPN is and things like that. And it came up last week that the client for the Microsoft Office Slack equivalent, which is called Microsoft Teams, the client for Teams in Linux was non-existent, and we were using the browser support for it. And within 3 days, somebody had connected us with the development team for Teams and with a product manager there who's responsible for taking care of Linux. And we're now internal open source helping to develop the Linux client. Actually, I get to run it on my machine. It's awesome. I can video conference again. Make sure I didn't miss anything here. Right. So then I reached out to my contacts in HR, my contacts who were actually already working for Microsoft or who had worked for Microsoft. And this is where I heard the contrary evidence. Right? I started asking people, what is this really like on the inside? And I heard complaints like, oh, well, they told us we had to open source everything, but the process is legal has to review every line of code that's going to be released under an open license. Holy shit. That sounds like a layer of hell. Managers complaining about losing a sense of authority because they were still doing the people manager thing, but now teams were so fluid from across the company and they didn't really know how much control that they had. Dev teams complaining about problems integrating Rando Calrissian from the outside world who was submitting great PRs with their own dev team. And having to learn that, yeah, Rando Calrissian's work should be valued the same way our own work is. I also even heard from some of my contacts in the executive layer about how hard it is to message this stuff. That, yeah, we really want to make an open source conversion, but man, getting that through 4 or 5 layers of hierarchy is very hard, and people still act in the old ways. In the end, my conclusion was, if this was embrace, extend, extinguish, I wouldn't be seeing those kind of pain points. If this was embrace, extend, extinguish, I wouldn't be seeing the money flowing this way. I wouldn't be seeing this kind of reorganization. Actually, what I got from my contacts was consistent with trying to turn 130,000 people around into a completely different model of working. That's not a surface level investment in this kind of model. It's very important. One of my interviewers put it very well. She said, it's not perfect and it really isn't finished, but it is happening. So what it's actually like on the inside? I've been working there for almost a year now, so that's long enough that the honeymoon period is starting to wear off. And I'm getting other job offers again and things like that. Again, I'm not a spokesperson, and I don't have visibility into the whole company. This is from my perspective as a developer manager within this particular organization, which is one of Microsoft's newest departments. So there's a lot to see. First of all, I made some predictions for myself, right? If I was right, Windows would continue to decline in importance and in revenue share. I would see increase in importance and revenue share from platform and software as a service offerings. I would see continued investment in compatibility and in cross-platform. So those are things that I watched out for. First of all, Windows importance. I don't know if anybody here knows this, but there is no Windows department anymore. Nobody's driving that ship. Windows is now the shared responsibility of the Azure interoperability people and the hardware people. So the people who are designing the Surface notebooks, or whatever you call a notebook tablet hybrid, nablets. Consumer Windows revenue last year down 8%. If anybody knows offhand the numbers for PC sales overall, PC sales are down 4%. This is going almost twice as poorly as the PC market is. And we announced Windows paid support plans. And actually, the Windows paid support plan is just a part of it. What I'm seeing is a lot of efforts to figure out what are some other ways that we can monetize the development effort that goes on there. Satya, from the beginning, has said Windows is the integration point for the things that are actually offering value. Office, Azure, the intelligent cloud, all this kind of stuff. We want to get that integration point into the hands of as many people as possible. So paid support on Windows 7, which we basically ripped off from Red Hat, right? That's the same model. Giving the updated versions for free, semantic versioning. We are doing, the Windows 10 is supposed to be the last version of Windows. We're not going to charge people for updates anymore. We're just maintaining this stuff for free. All of this goes in one direction. I know that I'm hoping to see an open source Windows, but again, if I was at the top, I would save that for like when you need a really big PR move, you know? Oh, they found out that Office actually runs on children's tears. We're open sourcing Windows, right? That will really help us with the press. PAAS and SAAS. This is the opposite story from Windows licensing. Office 365 revenue up 42%. Azure up 91%. Holy crap, right? There's no question where we should be putting our money and investment. Compatibility cross-platform, I have way more than I can fit on one slide. Partly that's because I'm closest to the product team, so that's what I get to see. But we have things like Azure Kubernetes Service, which is just Kubernetes, well implemented. Azure Open Service Broker. Anybody here into containerization? Hands up if you're familiar. You guys know what Open Service Broker is? It's a really new standard for interoperability across clouds. So you can have Kubernetes instances on Azure, AWS, on-prem, and who knows where else, and they all work nicely together. That is a model and an open standard that is really led and pushed by Microsoft. Golang. When I started at Microsoft, I thought, well, that's it. I'm never going to get to learn Go now because it's a Google product. No, actually, the HTTP proxy that everybody uses for Golang projects is a Microsoft project. Go4Source, which is one of the biggest community growth efforts for Golang. We do a lot of work with Golang, and I got to learn it finally. Azure Functions now, so that's the serverless offering, Lambda for Azure. And you can write in Python, PHP, TypeScript, Bash, JavaScript, most of the big open source languages. We've started open sourcing Azure services. This to me is a differentiator for Azure that I'd like to see us do more of. When you put something on AWS or you put something on Google Cloud less because we know it's at least based on Kubernetes, but in AWS it's a black box. Right? We don't really know how Amazon Container Services is running or how any of their Elastic stuff is working. Microsoft has open sourced a lot of our Azure services. You can run them on-prem, you can mix them, Service Fabric, all of this stuff, all the machine learning stuff, face recognition, run it yourself. We're very happy to do that. We're very happy to help you do that. We have another Linux distro. We're one of the leading firms in quantum computing, and we've open sourced our simulator and our language. And of course, we bought GitHub under the big banner of saying, hey, if this is where developers are, we want to be there. And so far, we haven't screwed it up. Fingers crossed. Sorry, Daumen gedrückt, right? You're supposed to press your thumbs. So my department is one of the leading departments at Microsoft, and it's seen as a model for how the rest of the organization is trying to work. We're called Commercial Software Engineering. And the way it works is similar to the Partner Catalyst team. When one of Microsoft's biggest customers, rather than startups, when one of Microsoft's biggest customers gets stuck on a problem that is in a cutting-edge area of tech, so containerization, machine learning, mixed reality, virtual reality, Internet of Things, all this great buzzwordy stuff. When they get stuck in one of those areas, we'll send in a team of a handful of developers to do architecture and to do a couple of sprints with their developers to get them to proof of concept. We do it completely for free. The only catch is we have to be allowed to open source our work. Of course, it's fine if you have some secret sauce, we'll wrap it in a library, and that's fine, we'll open source the rest. So we release on a BSD license by default or Apache. Sharing is an explicit part of our mission, and we're responsible for lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of open source projects that are relatively niche. So for example, one of my favorites was from the ML space a couple of years ago now. That was sentiment analysis for dark web sources, so places that are not usually indexed by crawlers based on keyword, and it was designed originally to help with health efforts in the United States, helping with some of the epidemics caused by the lack of education in that country. So the trouble is that moms who don't vaccinate their kids aren't very likely to go to a doctor to say, my kid has whooping cough, but they're very likely to post on Twitter about it. So this was a dashboard that lets us do that. And of course, there's lots of potential uses for this, and that's completely open source. You're welcome to it, and we support it still. Right, this is the slide. This took me a while to write. It's very, very hard. As somebody with a long open source background. But at least in the environment that I've seen, in the part that is my department and my work, this is real. These are real open source people and trying to be even more open source. There are corners of Microsoft where it's still a pain in the ass. There are absolutely still people who don't really get it. But it's also hard to turn 100,000 people around on a dime like this, and I think they're doing a pretty good job. Now, hit me. Hard questions, unpleasant questions,
I've got
accusations.
questions. A big applause at the moment for Campbell.
Oh, well then I should put up this slide while we do that.
I've got only one question. Are the Microsoft employees only allowed to color their hair in the Windows colors, or
No. You saw that picture. I had gray hair. That's not a Windows color.
No. Any one of you a less silly question than mine was?
Or more silly is okay.
Or more silly? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also a human.
Yeah, one there.
Let's talk about cancer. What do you think about the GPL license? Because I think the citation you had was about the GPL license.
What do I think personally about it?
Yes.
Oh, I love it.
Okay, what does Microsoft think in general?
I have to think for a second about what are the borders where the legal department has the opinion that matters. Well, it's pretty obvious to me why they chose BSD and Apache as the licenses that we release things under in a standard way, right? They allow commercial use, especially because we're working with large enterprises, most of which have no idea about open source. That's really comforting for them, and it means that it's easier for us to find an agreement with people like BMW and Volkswagen and all those guys. I see in the broader open source community, we're starting to see the real conflict from our own success. We adopted even the terms weak and strong copyleft are a bit debatable, right? But we adopted commercial-friendly open source licenses as a way of spreading the development model. And a lot of people felt when they started their projects, oh, I don't care, go ahead, use my project. I'll just be really happy if anybody pays attention. And now we see people like Redis, like MongoDB, all of a sudden having second thoughts about that. Now, it is completely correct that they should be choosing their license based on their own principles and how they feel about their work. And if they want more reciprocation in money or in code, that should be in their licenses. That's completely accurate. I think we're going to see a bigger swing back towards strong copyleft licenses. And I, for one, am a big fan of that.
Any further? No? Then thank you, Campbell.
Thanks very much, guys.